Okay, by show of hands, does this parable bother you? Okay, all right. The weeping and the gnashing of teeth. The parables are quite something, aren't they? Now, if the parables bother you, particularly say this parable, rest assured, that means you are a good and decent person. Nice. The parables are designed to pester good and decent people. They're designed to make us think. Now, of course, this one, known as the parable of the wedding banquet, is particularly stark. Debbie Thomas wrote, if you make this parable into a movie, the genre would be horror. There is good news to be had in parables, but it isn't usually evident at their first reading. Now, show of hands again, and don't say what it was that you were told, but how many of you in the past, through a sermon or through Bible study, have been given a certain interpretation of this parable? Hold your hands up a little higher. Okay, you got half and half. All right. How many of you were given in that interpretation, for example, that the second batch of invitees, after he murdered all the first ones, the second batch was us, the Christian church? Okay. Well, then I won't bother going through the whole way I had it interpreted for me before. Know this, I'm about to change that interpretation for you if you would like. No matter, though, what I have been told about who was who in this parable, I've never gotten an answer that I found satisfactory about who was that single guest at the end who was wearing inappropriate clothing. Don't get me wrong, I've been given some ideas that people have said, here's who it is. He's this sort of person you encounter in the faith world, or he's that kind of person. But the explanations of who he was and why he got bound and tossed into the outer darkness where there was weeping and gnashing of teeth, I've never been satisfied with any of the interpretations I've been given about who he was. I'm also happy to say that I've never been to a wedding, anything quite like this wedding that we read about today.
That's a good thing.
No one I know has ever been to a wedding, anything like this one. The only place I have seen where there was this much carnage in or about a wedding was on Game of Thrones, where every wedding was a bloodbath. I wish I had been on that show and someone said, would you marry me? I knew. But again, please rest assured that if this parable doesn't sit well with you, you are a good and decent person, and God has a message for us that is actually not quite so bad. In some people's interpretation of this parable, the king is God. But in my interpretation of this parable, and I am not alone, and I did not invent this interpretation, the king who had the wedding feast is not God. As I've said before, I think just last week, our God is not vengeful, violent, nor vindictive. So Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. Yes, it says that. That's true. And when I hear the word compare, I usually assume that whoever told me to compare the two things is suggesting to me that there are similarities between the two. But I've learned that this is not always so. Comparing two things can sometimes bring out their contrasts. Maybe the kingdom of heaven is nothing like the wedding banquet. Maybe the vengeful ruler is exactly that, a vengeful ruler, like Herod or Pilate. and with his pride wounded that none of the original invitees could be bothered to show up. Well, a fellow like that can't have a party and no one come. That would not make him popular in Hollywood. So he expanded the invitation. And now the new invitation sounds like it's open to everyone. And I get excited because I'm like, great, he's inviting everybody like he should have done in the beginning. I thought at first, when I first heard that parable, that he was having an Ebenezer Scrooge moment where on Christmas Day, he realized that everybody is welcome and wanted and invited. But I think we learn that only went so far. Yes, he wanted to fill the seats. Can't be a man like that and not have a full house. Maybe he didn't want to waste the food. So he opened the doors wide, and he didn't realize when he did that maybe some of the people who got in are the ones who couldn't afford to come because they couldn't afford the wedding robe. I suspect that it was a huge diss in that culture to be fortunate enough for the king to smile on you in your lowly station and give you an invitation to so high and mighty an event, but then you dare not to wear the right clothing. That could well have been the height of disrespect. It was a bridge too far for the king to deign to invite you, and you come like that. And so it goes on. Then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. Calvinists love this passage. It seems the new wedding invitation, though, was based largely on human largesse, on our own sense of charity. Now, there's human charity and there's God's justice. Human charity, as wonderful as it can be, has its limitations. God's justice is fair, it is bottomless, and it is even-handed. So bear in mind that maybe, just maybe, the king in this story is a king, as deeply flawed as any king could have been. Maybe the point of the story is this. This is how earthly kingdoms look and act when that kingdom or that king doesn't seek to serve Christ in all persons. Bear in mind that the Roman form of government heavily used the client-patron system, or the patron-client system. And that was where there were people who had influence, who had money, who had power, who might smile upon someone who was less than. And that person who was less than was fortunate enough to get that support and that privilege. But it was only given to them at the pleasure of the patron. You had to be fairly sycophantic to stay a client to the patron. And so maybe this wedding is how power, love for its own sake, becomes a god for us and leads us to ungodly behavior. And so this king, full of pride and pomp and circumstance, where maybe people kiss his ring because he's rich and powerful rather than loving him because he's just and kind, that king will not let everybody in to enjoy the spoils of the party. No, you have to show him the respect of wearing the right outfit. It may have been worse to have a party full of people wearing the wrong outfit than to have none show. I don't know. But you can't show up wearing the wrong outfit. Now, what if the man he throws out into the outer darkness because he's underdressed? What if that man dressed down on purpose to protest the misuse of power, knowing what it would get him? to protest and to let it be known that God's kingdom is just and it is kind, and that this king's kingdom is a mockery. And so they threw him into the darkness, and we presume that they've killed him. So I'm comfortable saying maybe, just maybe, the king is not God. And maybe the servants that he sent to get the original invitees were not the Hebrew prophets. Maybe the original invitees are not the Hebrew people. But what if the poorly dressed protester wasn't just some random, unnamed guy? Debbie Thomas asks it this way: what if the God figure in the parable is the one guest who refuses to accept the terms of the tyrannical king? What if he's the one guest who decides to not wear the robe of forced celebration and coerced hilarity? The one guest whose silent resistance leaves the king himself speechless and brings the whole sham feast to a thundering halt. She goes on, what if he's that one brave guest who decides that he would rather be bound hand and foot and cast into the outer darkness of Gethsemane, of Calvary, the cross, and the grave? He would rather be tossed into all of that than to accept the authority of a violent, loveless sovereign. And there ends Debbie Thomas's question. What if the underdressed man was Jesus? What if he was calling us and calling them to believe in the power of love over the love of power? And so in human pride and in brokenness, the king threw him into the outer darkness, thinking he had gotten rid of a ne'er-do-well. But just as St. John Chrysostom wrote in his Easter sermon a long time ago, hell took a body and discovered it was God. As we said last week, you can try to cancel Jesus, you can even kill him, but he comes back because God's love never dies. And so sometimes in the stories, God is not the king, but the beggar, calling us to our best selves over and against prideful power that is only used to hurt God's children. Dear God, help us to embrace and struggle with your parables, that like Jacob, we come away from the struggle both changed and blessed. Amen.